welcome to episode 163 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Denning in what is left of Los Angeles.
John, you had to deal with some fires down there. Did you make it through okay?
Yeah, I feel a little selfish saying that I'm okay, knowing how much of this city is not. So I suppose the answer is twofold. I got lucky and was spared. I didn't have to evacuate. Frankly, I didn't even have to worry that much. I was in kind of a safe area. I think the closest it got to me was the Palisades, are about 3 miles or so away, the edge of it. It was a little smoky at times, and I didn't like going outside because it was, chokish. But man, it's an absolute war zone around here. It's a hellscape.
Yeah, unfortunately, I wish I could say I had no idea what you're talking about, but we both have had our fire experience now.
Yeah. I've seen it up close and personal with the Santa Rosa fire that hit near you because I flew in there a couple weeks after. Take that and multiply it by about 1,000, and that's what LA looks like in places here. It's just areas the size of Manhattan are just going. It's crazy.
Yeah, sympathies with the people who are dealing with that, because it's a shocking thing to happen, and it's rough to deal with. So I've had it come close. I think it got within probably about half a football field at my house last time. Fortunately, I haven't had that problem before, but I know what that feels like, and it's terrible.
Yeah, it's rough. Well, not to dwell on that, but it probably does explain the question I'm going to ask you, which is, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking an Angry Mule.
I think I know what's in that, but for those who don't.
It's just a Moscow Mule, which is basically like vodka and ginger and lime and ginger beer and all that kind of stuff, with a little bit of extra kind of like heat added to it. So the local pub where I live makes this, and I drink it all the time. In fact, they'll usually start pouring it as soon as I walk in. So I just felt like having one of those today.
There you go. I had kind of committed to some sort of a dry January situation. I usually do a damp January, which is it's dry unless I leave the house to like travel, or if I have guests, then we drink. So it's mostly dry unless I'm out of town. But when all this fire stuff kicked off, me and my LA friends just decided, abandon all hope, ye-hoo inner. So I'm having an Irish coffee to try to pick myself up from what has been a very long weekend with testing and stuff, as well as a Red Bull. So I'm kind of doubling down on the energy today.
Okay.
So I'm double fisting in a way. The Red Bull's just Red Bull. The coffee's got some Jameson in it.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of energy drinking to me.
Yeah, if my heart stops halfway through this, Dave, just press on.
Yeah, I was going to do dry January, but that hasn't started yet. So maybe we'll see what February looks like, but that doesn't seem likely either.
Pick the shortest month if you're going to do it.
I don't mind it one way or the other.
You picked a song. Elaborate.
Well, this is multifold for me. First off, the song is called King for a Day and is by the band Pierce the Veil. And it's kind of cool because there's several things here. First off, King for a Day. The song's not really about it, but I feel like, John, with the way the crystal ball went for us, we were feeling like kings for more than a few days. And I love the band name too, because I feel like we've also pierced the veil of the secrecy around how they use tests and the predictive schedule of it. And probably most of it, I saw this band very randomly in Las Vegas last fall at a huge music festival, and they blew me away. And they're now on tour, or they're coming up on tour. So I'm going to go see them in June, right by where I live here. So up in Northern California. So I was just like, we need a little bit of angry music because this is definitely aggressive. It's more emo, screamo. So today it's the Angry Mule, angry music. Let's do it.
And I'm drinking an Irish coffee. What's more angry than the Irish? So there you go.
Being Irish, or at least having roots back into Ireland, not much. Let me say that much.
There you go. Let's get into the LSAT world. We're screaming through this pretty quickly. Let's talk about the tests, the upcoming stuff. And again, this is mostly just some housekeeping stuff. I'll go through the next 3. In fact, we've got one coming up. I mean, it just feels like as soon as one ends, the next one begins here with the January, February back-to-back. The February test is the next one. The registration deadline for this is passed about a month ago, in fact. This was over the day before Christmas on the 24th of December. Only 2 test dates for February. This is a notoriously small administration. It's going to run on a Friday and Saturday, February 7th and 8th. The school release for that will be on February 26th. That's a Wednesday. If you haven't signed up for that yet, you are, sorry, it's over. It's closed. If you have, that'll be Friday and Saturday. And they should open up the enrollment window for the pick your times for those days here pretty soon. The April test comes in a couple of months. The registration deadline for that is still open. It won't close until Thursday, February 27th. So you got a ways for that, a month or so. The test dates for that, they're going to open that back up to a 4-day test week, Thursday through Saturday again. That's going to be April 10th through the 12th, I think. Do I have this right, Dave? That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, that's a 3-day one?
Is that a 3-day one? Thursday, Friday, Saturday?
February's
That makes
2 days.
sense. Sorry, I counted days wrong. Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So April is a 3-day test, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, the 10th, 11th, and 12th. The school release for the April test is Wednesday, April 30th. And then just to throw it in there for good measure, the June test, which the registration for that is going to end on April 22nd. That will be a 4-day test again, because June is going to be pretty big, I'm suspecting. That'll run Wednesday through Saturday. That is going to be June 4th through the 7th. And school release on that will be Wednesday, June 25th. So that's the last of the 3 that we'll talk about here. But that takes you really through the early parts of the summer. So 3 to be thinking about. April really is the last test for most people when it comes to applying for schools to start this fall.
Yeah. Or to retake in order to maybe bump up some kind of scholarship reconsideration or get off the wait list. And for the February test, the time selection has opened.
Oh, it has already? Okay. I must have just
I
kicked
believe
it
was today, actually.
Okay.
And if you're taking any of those tests, obviously we've got courses and books and what have you, but we also run free webinars constantly. In fact, the day this comes out, which will be on Wednesday the 22nd, there is an LSAT 101 webinar that's coming up. There's another one on the 2nd of February, or the 4th of February. That is the RC skills test, always a good one. And then on the 19th of February, that logical reasoning common flaws. So you can just go to powerscore.com/free seminars, and it'll forward you over to the registration page where you can go ahead and select those. Otherwise, the URL is too long for me to read it out, and it makes no sense anyway. So that old URL has been updated, but it'll forward you over there now. And John, this always raises a question, because here we are. We have a bunch of webinars that are free. We've got the February LSAT coming up. I know that you've received this question many times. I've received it as well. Is there going to be a February mini ball?
Dave, my phone just vibrated while we've been doing this recording, and I just got this question. Literally since we started doing this podcast, this question has come in on Reddit.
Too much.
Yeah, so I've been getting this question quite a lot. Are we going to do an update to the January-February crystal ball with what would be considered what we call a mini ball, which is an update specific to the next test in the little 2-parter that we do for the main crystal balls? Are we going to do a February mini ball? And the short answer to this is no, we are not.
Yep.
Should I leave it there? Should we move on?
I mean, I think we should explain ourselves, because there are good and valid reasons for why we're not going to do it. So I guess, John, why not?
Yeah, well, the first thing I should say, I think, is that it probably seems a little counterintuitive, because as we're going to discuss, the crystal ball that we did for the January test that just ended was arguably, as we'll elaborate on and explain, probably the most accurate one that we've ever done, ever. And it seems a little strange on the heels of that kind of success that we wouldn't want to double down and really, again, kind of chase that success into February, given that we do seem to really have the best handle on things that we've ever had. But, and here's what I think has really governed the decision about the February test and the mini ball for it and not doing one. February tests, and the more we've kind of looked back at the last 3 of them, 22, 23, 24, they've proven to be particularly unique over the past couple of years in several notable ways. I mentioned before that they're only doing a 2-day test week for February because it's very small, both in attendees and, of course, that 2-day length. And what that's led to, at least in part, is that LSAC seems to really be willing to go a bit rogue and break with certain patterns of test reuse and behavior. And that's what we base our predictions on. In other words, the weirder that LSAC is willing to be, the harder it is for us to get a handle on what it is they're going to do. And thus our expectations are much harder. It's just murky. When we don't know what they're going to do because they could do anything, it really limits our ability to tell people things with confidence, to anticipate with confidence. So that's the first
If you think about it, small test group, this allows them to pull out tests that maybe aren't in the major rotation. And because of that, they can go further afield in what they choose. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem because it doesn't seem, and I know we're going to talk about this. In fact, this is probably an opportune time to just talk about what I think you and I both agree is the second point here, mm-hmm. which is the fact that February has always been a bit unpredictable.
Yeah.
This small test, the higher degree of variation, the less predictability, puts us in a position where we're not entirely comfortable with making, kind of official predictions for it.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, statistically, you and I have looked back at this. When we were putting the crystal ball together for the January test, we were doing this, I guess, around Christmas time or something. And we looked back and just tried to put a track record, a scorecard, really, a track record of our performance together. And at that point, we looked at the past 32 tests and we realized we'd gotten 30 of those 32 correct. The two misses were both February tests. It was the February 2022 and the February 2024 tests. Those are the only two we hadn't gotten right. And it was because of this exact thing, Dave, that you say, is that they had done something kind of quirky. The February 2024 test, for instance, they had used one exam for the entire time. The January 2021 test, that's all they used. It was a test they used before. It was a test they used again. It was just something no one could have seen coming, certainly not us. And so given that, and given that they have kind of eluded us with February's before, the last thing we want to do is miss again. And it's not for our vanity. It's for the fact that if we don't know that we're going to get things right, we don't want to take that chance for the sake of students.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point. It's not just that we're throwing darts at a wall and saying, yay, let's hope we hit it. Yeah. You don't do that and get 31 out of 33. You make predictions because you have a strong inkling or feeling that something is going to hit as part of it. And we've always felt that. And we've always been wary of February because of the size and the strange variation. And so when we were talking about this, I think it was yesterday, you and I were talking about what we should do about it. We know how unique this is. We know that it's hard to predict. I don't want to send people down the garden path of studying something that I'm really not certain is going to show up. I'll feel a lot better about April and June. Because those tests are bigger, they're going to be more uniform, they're going to be a little bit more standardized in terms of what they do. It doesn't mean that they're going to use some kind of hard, weird test for February. They just do things that we don't expect, like use one test throughout the entire administration. That is very unusual. We've seen many, many forms in the past, and that's not one that they do a whole lot. And so if you're not really certain what they're going to do, why predict it? Why waste people's time? And I think that's where you and I have fallen on this one.
Yeah. There's a second and kind of doubly confounding thing here too. And we're victims of our own success in a way here, is that the January predictions were so good that it took so much really off of the map, so to speak, the hit list of what we had in the original crystal ball, that what it would really do to the mini ball here is it would just shred the original crystal ball down to just a reduced version of the original. It would just leave you basically to review the scraps of what was left. This is not a bad problem to have, but, and here's the good news, I think it's one that we can actually solve in this recap episode here. So my goal, Dave, and I imagine yours as well, is that what we can do with this episode itself is just tell people how to use that original crystal ball, which is still available, still free to everyone, for the February test, by simply telling you what to ignore, what to remove, basically, from the tests that we don't now think could be reused to the topics in reading comp that we now know won't come up in February. So you can still use that as a predictive tool, but know that you take it with a grain of salt, because February is less likely to use any of those predictions just because it's February. It's weird.
Yeah. Essentially, we're not going to make an official prediction. We're going to say what happened is we got so much right. we're going to remove all of that. Whatever's left, we hope it shows up in February, but I don't think you and I would go to the LSAT casino in Vegas and put a bet on about that being the case. Maybe it hits, maybe it doesn't. If somebody looks at that and says, well, I don't want to waste my time with it, that's fine. I can tell you that the question, percentages and the likelihoods of certain question types like strengthen or must, all that stuff is still completely valid. Yeah. But when we talk about RC topics, we're not going to update it because we don't think it can be updated with accuracy. We will do a crystal ball for April and June. All right. I can guarantee that is going to happen. But February, this is just an unfortunate test the way that it's set up. And in reviewing our performance, we don't feel like you can predict it. Who knows? Maybe they'll use something that is like very common and exactly what we expected, because obviously internally we'll make predictions, but they may not. And it won't surprise me at all if they don't.
Yeah. There's a note basically that I wrote that I was going to post on Reddit if we hadn't had this conversation here. And if you'll indulge me, I don't think I need to post it now because we're having this conversation here. But if you'll indulge me to read a quick note, because this is what I was going to say on Reddit. Now I can say it here. But the note that I was going to say basically is a sort of a, not quite mea culpa, but just explanatory point, was that, you and I have always said that above all, we would never do these things as like a parlor trick or a gimmick or a guessing game. It's either we're confident that we're right and this is going to help people, or we simply keep quiet, at least about the things that we don't know. So when it comes to February, there are things in the original crystal ball that you can count on. Like you just said, Dave, conceptual discussions, question type frequencies, recommended sections and passages. Those are all useful. But there are also things that we feel are more about luck than likelihood, test section reuse and passage topics when it comes to February. And we want to be upfront about that. So that's why we're not going to do the mini bowl.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, that LSAT's right around the corner anyway. There's hardly any time to even think about it or analyze it or absorb all that information. So that's the answer. Everybody who asks us from now on will get pointed to this section of the podcast so they can kind of hear it directly from us. But hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, ask us a question.
Yeah.
Again, no point in making predictions if you're not totally certain. It'd be kind of like sometimes I go bet on NFL games. And I'm like, look, I don't know who's going to win this game. Guess what? I don't bet that game.
Right.
If I don't know what the over is going to be or what have you, I'm not going to go ahead and bet it. Sometimes I have really strong feelings, and that's when you want to bet. That's when we do these crystal balls or mini balls, as the case may be. So that is the update. Should we talk about this January 2025 LSAT, Jon?
I am ready. Let's do it.
You're ready. There's plenty of content because, as usual, there was an international test as well as a domestic test, so we got all that extra stuff. But let's start off by talking a little bit about what the 4 test days look like. And notice here you got January with 4 test days. As it turns out, there's around 25,000 people who took this test. That is a sizable exam. February will be way smaller. But it actually kind of got bigger every single day. It started on Wednesday the 15th. Around 5,400 people tested that day. The next day, Thursday, was about 5,700. Friday was 6,500. And then on Saturday was the biggest of the 4 days. That was 7,700 people. That adds up to around 25,300. There are makeups coming up on Tuesday, the 28th of January. And there's always some makeups, although LSAC did tell me that there are fewer makeups this time as a percentage or per capita than in the past. So that's obviously something they track, and they're very happy when that's a lower number, and it looks like we got that in January. So obviously some people still had problems. If you're one of those individuals, I'm sorry. I know how terrible that is. You have my sympathies. When you go in to take that makeup, you will not see anything from the test that you originally started. You will see an entirely new test. So you don't get to restart or pick up where you left off or, God forbid, redo any sections. But that is still coming. But fewer people overall as a percentage were affected than previously. So that's kind of a nice piece of news to have. One good thing, though, if you are a retaker, you still get your score the exact same time as everybody else, and that is Wednesday, February 5th, around 9 a.m. Eastern, although it's really more like 8:50 and change.
It's usually a little early.
All right. Jon, I'll keep on if you don't mind.
No, by all means.
Any test proctor issues that you saw? Any kind of major problems across the board with the system?
I didn't see anything across the board, But I mean, as always, there's scattered issues. I mean, you're never going to get through a test, especially a test with 25,000 people, without some people having problems. I mean, there's never perfect. And perfect is obviously what it should be, what we all hope for and aim for. So I saw a lot of complaints. I think Friday might have been the worst day for complaints that I saw, certainly at least online, with people posting a lot of remote problems, with people having, gotten kicked off, or people having proctor issues, annoying proctors who didn't understand, proctors who bailed or, booted them for reasons that were unreasonable. But for the most part, I think people who were testing in person seem to have pretty good experiences. Remote people, I think, got it a little worse as a percentage, but nothing systemic that I saw, which, I mean, at least that part's good. It's never good when anyone has a problem, though, so certainly my sympathies for anybody who did.
Yeah, it's interesting here because the system itself seemed to work all right. It's always the humans inside the system, the actual proctors. And then sometimes you hear about test centers where there's just somebody creating a ruckus, or, they can't stop their leg from moving, or coughing or humming or whatever it is, or noise outside. There's all these kind of like almost structural or built-in problems. But at least there was no systemic problem, because when those happen, hundreds, if not thousands of people get affected all at once. And those are truly the worst kind of problems to run into, because so many people get affected.
Yeah, when LSAT's back end goes down, or proctor, the whole proctoring system crashes or something. I didn't see anything like that. I did see some login issues, so I guess that was pre-proctor, pre-human. But I think most of that got resolved from what I could tell. Again, if it didn't, submit the complaint, apply for the makeup, you should be granted. If they don't grant it at first, continue to press, be polite but persistent, and they should grant it to you, and you will get your score back at the same time, so there shouldn't be a delay at least.
All right, let's move along, talk a little bit about some of the disclaimers and reminders. Oh, this is an abbreviated version.
Your favorite
the
part.
full version.
Your favorite.
If anybody wants the full version, go listen to any of the last test recaps. I'm not in the energy for it yet. But I will say this, just a few comments about what we do in terms of making test predictions and recaps. And the first one is always the same. We just ask that you don't summarize this online. The nuance is easy to miss. Just send people to the podcast. We'd rather have them hear it directly from us. It's available on every major service. I'll also point out that, when we kind of like go through all of this information, you may not hear your section talked about. And if that's the case, it's because we didn't hear from you. We can only report on what we hear and have actually confirmed. We think we have most of the test. We think we may be missing one section for international test takers, but we'll cover that when we get to it. But as always, if we don't get a report back from someone who had one of these sections, there's no way for us to know for sure. We get a lot of different reports from a lot of different people. Some of them are amazing in terms of their detail, and I really, really appreciate those. Those are always welcome. But sometimes people are like, hey, you didn't cover my section. I'm like, why didn't you let me know beforehand? It would have been a big help. So other than that, just keep in mind that what we're doing is we're using information from many different sources, not just test takers. We have our own information about these tests, the history of their usage. This is why we're able to do a recap. And then this is also why we're able to do crystal balls, because we're able to put all that information together. We've got a wide variety of levels of achievement and scoring, giving us reports, a lot of information, both historical and present on this. We put that all together, and then we're able to figure out what is real and what is not, because we know that everybody gets 2 scored LR and 1 scored RC, and some people get an experimental, many of them, most of them, but not everybody. So we can use that information and figure out what is real. And we assume that what has been real in the past is typically going to be real in the present and future, and that's usually very consistent. So, John, that's it. Let's go on to the International January LSAT.
We got right through that. I was mid-drink.
Didn't want to do it, man. I've done it 40 times. I'm sick of it.
I love it.
I'm over it.
All right, let's talk internationals. We're going to do these separate. The last time I think we had an international test was last October, and we intermixed international and domestic because there was actually some intermixing of content between the two. Internationals got some of the same material, some of the same sections as domestic, and so we intermixed the two. This time, internationals, from what we could see, what we could tell, got their own exclusive stuff. There was no overlap between international and domestic test takers in terms of content. So we're going to keep the two separate this time. So this is going to be exclusively for internationals here to begin. So international test takers. And what we typically do here is we start with kind of a self-grade with the crystal ball. But as always, when we talk about the crystal ball as it applies to internationals, we're not really trying to predict international tests with the crystal ball. And the reason why, a little bit like February, is when it comes to international tests, the test makers really just don't follow any given rules here. They can use old tests. They can use tests they've used 3, 4, 10 times before. They can mix and match sections from different things. They don't really follow any kind of set behavior or guidelines. So we don't really try to predict. When it comes to internationals, it's just really not geared towards international tests, the crystal ball, because the same rules of reuse that they use for domestic tests that we've been so successful in kind of deciphering and decoding, it doesn't apply. Sometimes there's overlap, sometimes we get lucky, and it works. In this case, however, neither of those occurred. So here, the crystal ball didn't really apply to internationals. That's a bummer. It wasn't our intention, and that's just the way that it went. I will say, when we get to logical reasoning, there's going to need to be a little bit of some explanatory preface to it. Just know that that's coming. But first, let's start with reading comp, because this was easier. So, Dave, do you have anything to say before I get into the sections?
No, you want to do the LR and I'll do the RC here?
Yeah, you do the RC.
All right.
You can just give you a little. Thank you.
Gonna give you a little break, because you'll have to do all the LR stuff on international. And just let me follow up by confirming what you're saying is international test is much smaller.
Yeah.
Notice how when you have a really small test group, LSAC has more options at their disposal. And also the rules for the international test are very different, just because of the non-overlap that they typically want to have, but they don't always. Let's talk about the section that I think was the primary usage of RC. And this is a section that we have seen multiple times before, back to January 2021, June 2022, February 23, even August 2024. So relatively recently this was used. It's a 27 question section. It's got Big Bang Theory and the ever-expanding universe, features our friend Neil deGrasse Tyson. Got one on Kafka novels. John, you and I have actually talked about this passage before, because I'm a big Kafka fan.
Yep.
Sometimes feel like I'm living in Kafka's world these days. Before the law. Then we've got one on law and legal environment policy evasion statutes, especially regarding dumping pollutants into water sources. And then one about diplomacy and diplomatic responsibilities in foreign relations in the UN. The Kafka passage is the comparative that is in there. We know that that one is real and it was scored. Now, something that you saw, John, and you and I ended up talking about was, especially on Reddit, there was a discussion of international RC, and there were a number of people in there who said, hey, I didn't have that section. So from the sound of it, you'd think that there's another real RC that's floating around in international. And we were hoping that we would hear from one or more people to kind of give us an update. We didn't get that. So if you're listening, you're like, well, I didn't have that Kafka Big Bang Theory diplomacy section. I had a different one. Send us a message now and tell us what was on it, so that we would actually know. Because otherwise we can't help you, and we're not going to be able to predict the scaling, because we don't know which section was actually used. None of our reporters on the test had that section. And again, it's international, so it's a really small group anyway. So we would love to hear from you if you had that second RC section that was scored, so to speak.
I probably got 30 to 50 messages about Kafka. I got no messages about something else, but I did see a few things in response to the Kafka posts about like, oh, I didn't have those. And I chased those people around, frantically. Like, what did you get? Hello, tell me things.
They don't want to respond.
I never heard anything, never got anything. And so I have no idea. It could have just been trolling. I have no idea. That happens sometimes with people like, not me, but I don't know. So if there was another section out there, I don't know what it was. I don't know what was on it. Can't help you there. Sorry.
Yeah, there's fewer international students, and they're also usually in time zones that are not really conducive to our time zone. So not hearing back is not anything we take personally. Reports tend to trickle in for like close to 7 to 10 days after any given LSAT. So we'll probably hear about it at some point here. But John, why don't you kind of take us through the LR, which was a little bit more involved?
Yeah, LR was a little squirrely with this one because there were actually 4 logical reasoning sections in use. So that's the first thing to keep in mind here. There were 4 logical reasoning sections being used, what I'm just going to call for now LR1, LR2, LR3, and LR4. And we saw these combined in various ways. Every test that I saw, every test form that I saw internationally had 3 logical reasonings and that 1 RC with Kafka. So just keep that in mind. 3 logical reasonings out of the 4 available sets, LR1, 2, 3, and 4, 3 of them being used. In combining those, these were the various combinations that I saw. Think about this with me. I saw LR1, 2, and 4. I saw LR1, 3, and 4. I saw LR2, 3, and 4. Those were the 3 combinations that everybody had. 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. Now, trying to figure out which of those 4 sections was experimental then became pretty easy. It's the only one that appeared every single time. Mathematically, that has to be true. If section 1 was experimental, then LRs 2, 3, and 4 didn't have an experimental. If section 2 is experimental, then 1, 3, and 4 didn't have an experimental. This is the only way it works, is if section 4 in LR 1, 2, 3, and 4, if section 4 is experimental. It's the only way it works. Because if you try to make one of the others experimental, at some point you don't have an experimental section. If you think about this mathematically, it's the only way it'll work.
I think most people are willing to agree with you.
I would hope so. If you're not willing to concede it, I hope most people are doing right now the LSAT thing, which is trying to argue against me or trying to come up with some kind of exception. I hope your instinct is contrarian, because that's a good mindset to have when it comes to this test in your future careers. But I promise you can either take my word for it or you can actually sit down and just wait till you figure out that I'm right. Every combination had section 4, LR4, involved. That's the only way to get that experimental to always be there. Section 4, as I'm about to outline them, LR4, as I'm about to list them out, was the experimental of this group. It's the only possible way.
When you say that, you're talking about the 4 sections you're going to cover here.
Yeah, so when I list out the 4 sections here in order, LR 1, 2, 3, and 4, the 4th one that I list in this was your experimental section. The first 3 that I list are all going to be real.
And you would have had some combination as a student, 2 of those 3 typically.
Yeah, so when you had the LR1 that I'm going to list, LR2 that I'm going to list, and LR4 that I'm going to list, the 4th one here is going to be your experimental. LR1, 3, and 4, experimental. Again, if this is confusing, I've left it kind of vague because I haven't listed the topics yet, but...
It's only confusing because the sections are also numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4, so...
Right.
But as long as you know you're talking about the 4 LR we're about to talk about, then it's all good.
Yeah.
How about LR1, John? Why don't you hit it?
Okay. So the first LR, as I've kind of listed them out here, this was a real logical reasoning section for international people. If you had this section, it was scored. This is from August 24. This had traditional Japanese gardens, white tigers in zoos, damage to rock paintings in caves with tourists touching them and stuff. This had a thing about flood insurance and commercial properties versus residential properties, politicians getting upgraded seats and first-class tickets, alcohol and exercise, encrypted downloads. That was a real section. LR2, as I've listed them out here, this was another real section, also sourced from August 2024. This had vitamin C pills, processed breakfast cereals, and nutrition. Had one on monarch butterflies, owls and falcons, and the building of a warehouse. Flea-like parasites on dinosaurs, copying DVDs. That was a real section. LR3, as I've listed them out here, this was another real section. I think this is going to surprise some people, but this was real. This was sourced to January of 2022. This had a question on hand washing, paper towels versus air dryers and spreading bacteria, a question that a lot of people were talking about. A lot of people were confused about whether it was Gerald or Gary. It's Gerald, I believe. And Yvonne and Mary signing a petition. Real versus synthetic food dyes, brainwaves, galactic galaxy travel, electronic devices, computers, and having an algorithm, and whether you could program it to create true works of art. That was a real section. Those were your 3 real LR sections, international people. White tigers, vitamin C pills, and Gerald and Yvonne signing a petition. What that means is LR4, as I've listed it here, your experimental section, was the one with the supernova, the star, the birth of King Charles, Napoleonic Wars, cinnamon on bread to preserve it, lizards with spots. That was your experimental. That section is one that every single person had. That means it had to be experimental. It's the only way to make it so that everybody had an experiment. So there you go. I know that's going to come as a surprise for some people, because a lot of people were thinking that the one about the hand washing was experimental, but no, it was the one with supernova.
Okay, so let's talk about the scaling then and the predicted scale of this. A lot of these sections we've seen before, so I think we're pretty familiar with them. We've actually predicted all these sections previously, and in this case, we don't see any reason to particularly change what it is that we've done. Remember how this works. We're trying to predict the number of questions that you can miss to get a 170. The baseline start that we have is you can miss 7 questions. Then we talk about each section. You listen for your sections, and then you see how that would change your scale. Will it stay at 7 that you can miss? Will it move it to 8 that you can miss? Depends upon the difficulty of the section. We always try to be conservative, so just keep that in mind. In this case, this one is fairly easy. First off, the RC, the Kafka, Big Bang, the diplomats, and so forth. We've predicted this before, called it a hard section. We think it is. It's not the worst, but it is still on the more difficult side. It would move the scale from 7 to 8. Then with your 3 LR sections, no matter what combination that you had, none of them move the scale. So everybody who takes the international ends up with -8 as their scaling for this, meaning you can miss 8 questions to get a 170. It seems pretty consistent there. I'm not even going to read the 3 LR because it doesn't really matter if you're an international test taker. It will matter when we get to the domestic test, which is coming up next though, but here it does not. RC moves at 1, none of the LR moves it, so it goes from 7 to 8 for everyone. And we're done with the international. That was easy enough. We're actually moving through this pretty well. Feeling good about it. So now let's move on to the domestic test. Domestic in this case means US and Canada primarily. I saw a conversation with somebody who was like, I'm in Canada, so international. I'm like, no, you're not. You're actually part of the whole LSAC North American domestic test set, non-international. There's no time zone issues to be dealt with. And John, let's start off with the crystal ball discussion. We just talked about how it doesn't really apply to the international, and it is designed wholly for the domestic test. You've kind of alluded to it before. What's your take on how we did with the crystal ball?
I wish we could just end right now, actually. If this could be the final conversation of the day, I'd be pretty happy with it. Because this was, Dave, and I always hesitate to, I always am cautious with hyperbole, and I don't think this is it. This was probably the best across-the-board set of predictions that we've ever had, which, given the size, the scale, the scope of this particular test, you talked about the 25,000 plus people. That's especially gratifying because when you're this accurate for that many people, you know that you've helped a tremendous number of, thousands and thousands of people gained a huge advantage based on how well that crystal ball went. 2 of the 4 LRs were brand new. The other 2, as we'll discuss, came from the exact test that we said was the most likely to be reused. Literally the test at the top of our list in the crystal ball that you went through early in it when you talked about test reuses and the likelihoods. Not only did the most commonly tested RC section come from that test as well, but any RC that wasn't brand new, in other words, 2 of the 3 RCs that were tested, we listed every single topic, save for one, and I'll talk about this, that we excluded intentionally because it was so just uselessly generic. We knew it, obviously, because we knew the other 3, but we didn't include it because it was just bland. Not only that, we even gave people multiple recommended passages to practice on the exact topics in both of the reused sections that matched what was tested. I'm talking Lamarck, I'm talking Mali, the country, not the fun kind, Chinese literati art. All of that was there in recommended passages. And I'll cover all of that as we get into the content, of course, but good God, was this a good week for anyone who paid attention to that crystal ball, man. And I have hundreds, and if we ever want to go on just a marketing blitzkrieg with this, I've got hundreds and hundreds of messages from people just like, I don't know how you do it, but this was life-saving.
I'm sure they would say, yeah, we'd love to do that if you do it all for us, put it together, mix and match it. But one of the things that's interesting is, when we talk about the exact topic and say, hey, we think there's going to be a passage on Lamarck or Mali, and we go back in the past and we find a passage topic that's similar, it's not the same passage. And so sometimes people look at that and they say, well, it doesn't matter, it's different. Yeah, but keep this in mind. It's proven that LSAC has these streams of topics that are written by the same person. Maybe you're not getting the exact same passage, and you're not going to. But what if you're getting something written by the same person? That's hugely advantageous. And so it isn't going to change, your score from a 150 to a 170 or anything crazy like that, but it can only help. And that's the entire goal that we have there.
Yeah, and they take a lot of tonality of the same stuff too. They're not going to have one passage about, Mali that deals with it in one way and then turn around and be like, no, actually, it's a shame that colonialism didn't, take hold sooner or something. They're always going to take similar things on this. They're not going to talk about Lamarck mechanisms working one way and then have another one that says, oh, no, actually, it actually works like this. Evolution is wrong, kind of thing. Genetics, in fact, works this way. It tends to just reveal the way that the test makers are going to treat certain ideas that are, in fact, consistent.
Exactly.
So, shall we dive into some RC?
Absolutely.
All right. Let me take some of this since, again, I was the one largely doing it in the crystal ball, and I think I can kind of do some cross-referencing as we go through. I'll start with, there were 3 scored sections of RC and 1 experimental that we saw, and I can't imagine that we missed anything here. RC tends to be the easier of the 2 scored types to track. So let me start with the 3 real sections of reading comp, then I'll get to the experimental, and then we'll look at some logical reasoning. And I'll start with what I think was the most commonly tested of the reading comp, and this actually came from the most predicted of the tests that we talked about too. The first section of reading comp that we saw first thing out of the gate Wednesday morning came from that test I mentioned that we predicted as the most likely, and that's a reuse of the October 2022 LSAT. This was 27 questions. This was a real section, of course. These were the 4 passages. We listed all 4 of these topics in the crystal ball. The first was about evolution and gene expression, and it used specifically grasshoppers and locusts as an example. And this was a passage dealing with Lamarck mechanisms. There were 2 recommended passages in the crystal ball on this. One was from PT 110, one was from PT 145. The second was about international accords and treaties and norms compliance. This was the comparative passage. The third, probably the hardest passage in this section, was about banking practices, I believe in US and Canada. This one we listed with quotes as stable banks. I had a number of people text me or message me and say that they had looked up what stable banks were and it helped. Centralization was a key theme in this. Again, a tricky passage. And then the fourth was about Chinese painting, specifically what they call literati, an art movement in the 20th century and different views on that. There was a recommended passage on literati art movement. This was a PT 120 in the crystal ball. So again, I think you and I were both doing, somersaults, seeing this right out of the gate on Wednesday.
Oh yeah, it was a good day.
Yeah, it was. The second set of real reading comp passages that we saw also predicted. This was from January 2022, originally seen in February of 2020 rather, sorry. We listed 3 of these. We skipped one on purpose, as I'll point out as we go. This was where we saw Mali come in, mining the gold rush in San Francisco. This was, I believe, the first passage. It was comparative. There was a recommended passage from PT 147 about Mali. There was a passage in this about modern protest literature, specifically Ann Petrie's 1940 novel, The Street. She was mentioned in that crystal ball as well. The one that was not mentioned was about a new tax plan, about compliance with tax law and regimes. I think this had to do with gamers and people cheating tax laws and stuff. I didn't include that in the list of topics because there's really not much to say about it. How do you look up a new tax plan? So I left that out just because, again, it's so generic. I don't think it would have done people any good. But we knew it. We knew it was there. And then finally, the fourth passage, and a tricky one for some people at least, was about ice cores in Greenland and things that they could reveal about past climate and volcano data. So that was, again, another set of real passages that people saw. And then finally, there was a third set of passages that people saw. Originally, this was only given to people who had an accommodation to have no experimental section. which is an accommodation you can get. A lot of people were surprised to learn that. These were new. They're real, but we had not seen these before. These 4 passages were on Scott Joplin, a ragtime, composer, ragtime music and high opera. There was a passage, a comparative about government regulations, what they called mandatory and transparency disclosures, a passage about shopping malls and their impact on downtown economies and shopping districts, and then a passage about the great physicist and mathematician Emmy Noether and her contributions, despite going somewhat under the radar, and how they related to Einstein and her remaining unknown despite being quite influential in small circles. Tricky passage as well. So those were the 3 real scored sections of reading comprehension. Paired with that ragtime passage set was an experimental set. Also, again, 27 questions. It had a passage on leadership strategies that was comparative. A strange sounding passage on a potato-shaped Earth. This had to do with Indian Ocean geoids and how there were Earth low points and how gravitational pulls shaped the shape of the Earth. A passage I would love to read about the movie Legally Blonde and Elle Woods and attorney-client privilege, how her client tells her something but asks her not to tell the rest of the defense team. And then another passage I think I would love to read about hip-hop and syncopation beats, specifically related to the group's Public Enemy and to Grandmaster Flash.
And the Furious Five.
The Furious Five.
One thing I will note is that Scott Joplin ragtime section, since it was a new usage, as we talk about in the crystal ball, we weren't trying to predict new usages or first-time usages, as it were. That's not, we don't know when they're going to actually pull that out after using it as an experimental and turn it into a scored section. So of the 3 scored sections, the 2 that we tried to predict did actually appear. The third one that they used was not on our radar to try to predict. So 2 for 2, which is a percentage that I think you and I will always take. The other thing is here you go with Legally Blonde, you've got hip hop and Public Enemy. Again, more modernized topics. We're starting to see some of these creep into real sections, but still mostly on the experimental side.
Yeah. But I mean, again, we saw Golden Girls, we've seen Twilight, hip hop Outcast was a real passage somewhat recently, I believe. So
Afrobeat was that.
Yeah. So we're starting to see some of what used to be experimental. We had this sense of are they trying to be hip or this pop culture thing that they're starting to do?
I just think all the
We're going
old
to have
people
Legally
used
Blonde
to make,
in a few years. It'll be there.
Yeah, dude, but all the old people who used to make passages are dying. So now they've got new younger people who want to write about something that's not 50 years old.
Yep.
Or something less boring than, tax codes and a new regime.
There you go. So there's your
we'll come back with the scaling on that in a bit. You want to continue on with LR? You want me to do a couple of them?
I'm good. What are you feeling? There's only 4.
Why don't you continue on, and then I'll do. There's only 3 of these here, and then I'll do the scaling at the end, per usual.
Yeah. There's 4 scored LRs. Interestingly, here of the 4, 2 were new and 2 were reuses. Once again, kind of like with reading comp, if it was a reuse, we predicted it exactly. Specifically, the LR, we don't try to predict topics. I mean, that would just be, can you imagine the nightmare that would be if we got in there and we're like, we predict this topic and this topic, 25 per section, these crystal balls would last for 2 days. But we do try to predict tests and sections even where we think these are going to come from. And the test that we predicted was the most likely for reuse was October 2022. Again, if you look back at the crystal ball, that is the top test in that reuse column. Dave talked about it as this is the one we think is coming. What did they pick from? What did they reuse? They reused October 2022. For both of the scored reuse sections of logical reasoning, that was the test. Here was the first real logical reasoning section from October 2022. It had these questions on it. It had fairy circles in Namibia, had to do with termites. This, interestingly enough, is a stimulus and a topic that they have used on a release test before. I think this time it was a weakened question. On the one that's released, it's a tricky question. It's strengthened. It's really interesting about burrowing termites in the roots. It's a great question, yeah. This same section had another question that a lot of people were talking about barnacle repelling paint on boats. This section had a topic about airline overhead compartments or bins, a noisy environment and bluebirds crying. There was a tricky question about a prototype needing at least 2 of 3 things to be approved. Wham's shoes, which is kind of funny, manufacturing these cheap shoes. A spiritual river that heals wounds but's gotten polluted. I imagine that's probably a Ganges reference. Commercial space flight. If you had any of those questions, if that rings a bell, that section for you did count. That was real. Again, from the test that we thought was most likely. The other section scored from that same test, this is also real, had these questions. Diving birds, grebes, or I think that's how you pronounce it. This was the one at a lake. They were being poisoned by selenium, but indirectly, I think from the worms or something they were eating. Factory workers wearing a back safety belt, but still getting hurt. There was a funny question about 10-month-old babies throwing food off a high chair, a topic that we've actually seen before on other tests. Delivery fees on kitchen appliances, refrigerators, I think. Question a lot of people were using to identify this section was about Chinese terracotta warriors. That was a popular one being talked about. And then the WHO issuing a statement against processed meats being dangerous. So that was another scored section. Those were the two that, again, we predicted and thought were coming. If you recognize any of those topics and can identify them to a section, that entire section was scored. Those counted. Perfect. So those were the two reused sections. There were two more, though, that were scored. Both of these, we couldn't have predicted both of these were new. So, Dave, let me just knock these two out as well.
Cool.
This section as well was scored. If you recognize any of these, this section counts. There was a section that had questions on superheroes and supernatural movies. Commonly talked about question about kangaroo rats' noses and respiration, dehydration, some sort of evolved system that led them to breathe in the desert or something. Tough question about smog and its health effects. Legality of driving barefoot and, I guess, braking power or braking time. Unconscious memory study, where when people were under, they would repeat the word face and see if they could complete some kind of puzzle when they woke up. Classifying primates, it was either chimps or gorillas, as people versus things. Economic investment and trading and things in Denmark and Germany. And then crickets underground in a hole chirping whether lizard predators would stay nearby or leave. If you recognize any of those, that section was scored. And then the final scored section, the fourth of, I believe, 4, also new, had questions on vitamin E benefits, being recommended or not. Chemical in coffee, a really tricky question. Chemical in coffee that made people less susceptible to Lyme disease because the chemical repelled ticks, which of course carry Lyme disease. Secretly automating work. Tough question about medieval England and European British Isle English wood mills versus stone mills. Turmeric and ginger being used in cooking, and they found them in medieval bowls or something. Governing antibiotics being given to cattle and livestock for growth, regulations about that, and then hiring more computer science teachers and a burden for doing so. That was the final real scored section. It is possible, as a disclaimer, that we missed one that has slipped through, maybe a very, very small use section. But from what I could tell, those were the 4 and only 4 that were scored.
Yeah, and as usual, we're not going to cover the experimental LR because that just seems to cause more confusion than clarity.
Yeah.
But again, interesting 4 sections there, John. The first 2 right off the tests that we thought that they were going to be coming off of. So that felt pretty good. It meant that the recommended problem sets, the choices that we made there to kind of mirror those sections felt good for us. The other 2 sections had not been used previously. They are new first-time usages. Again, we're not trying to predict that. So literally, you kind of go through this whole thing, and there were 4 sections that could have, that had previously been used that would have been candidates for reuse. We were able to predict all 4 of those.
Yeah.
The other 3 sections were first-time uses of those exams, which we're not trying to predict. So this is part of the reason that I think where John and I both felt like kings for a day or, 4 days as it were, was because what we tried to predict, we did predict. And that's our goal.
Yeah.
So, and when we're able to do that, we know immediately from what people say online and also what they send us that a number of people were helped out. And that's why we do this. So really, really gratifying to see something like that happen.
Yeah, not to keep doing victory laps, but this one felt particularly good. And I mean, not so much good that like, yay us, but yay us for how much I think it was able to help people, that they could go in and be like, I recognize this in reading comp, or I listened to your October 22 podcast and I recognize this thing about whatever it is, fairy circles, or I've seen this, I heard about this thing about these selenium birds. that to me felt really good, that they're like, I know this is real.
Yeah, and now we get a little bit of a break because if we're not making official predictions for February, as we explained earlier in the podcast, we can't be right or wrong, essentially, which is nice.
I ride this wave.
It would be good not to be judged for a test here. Let's get into the scaling prediction, the matrix as we call it. And again, brief review. What we're trying to do is predict the number of questions that you can miss to get a 170. To do that, we start by thinking that you can miss 7 questions overall for a typical test. Then we're going to go through each of the RCs and each of the LRs, and we're going to adjust that according to the difficulty. Some sections have no impact on how many questions you can miss to get 170. Some of them will loosen it a little bit. So what you should do here is you should listen for your section, first your 1 RC and then both of your LRs, and then add that on to the 7 that you can miss, so that you would end up with, say, 7, then 8, then maybe 8.5, depending upon how this will all work out and what your exact test configuration turns out to be. All right, and the last thing I'll say is John and I are always conservative. We've actually been talking recently about maybe being a little bit less conservative, but we're not going to adjust what we've done before for the most part. So that'll have to be a conversation that we have maybe in April or June, or maybe post-February test. We'll have to see how that goes. Let's start with RC. Everybody starts by being able to say they can miss 7 questions to get a 170. What about that October 2022 section about gene expressions, compliance, stable banks, the Chinese literati? This is one that we had moving the scale before. We're going to continue to stick by that and say that everybody who had this would move from 7 questions you could miss to 8. And that's what happens. The harder a section, the more the scale moves and loosens in response to that. So if you had this and you felt it was hard, yes, we think it was hard as well. We think the people who make this test think it was hard, and they'll move the scale. What about the Jan 2022 section about gold rush, protest literature, the tax plan? That was so nondescript. And then Greenland ice cores. This one we don't think is too bad. We had this as 0 before. We're going to keep it there. So if you had this section, you'd stay at 7. And then last, the new ragtime, mandatory disclosure, shopping malls, and the physics passage. This is mixed reviews, but we're going to go ahead and give it a 1 as a movement to move if you had this from 7 to 8. So I think it was tough enough to move it over a little bit there. So everybody is at 7 or 8 after that, depending upon the section that you had. Now let's get into LR. That first one from October 22 about fairy circles, the boat paints and the barnacles and so forth. This is a tough section, and we think this moves the scale an entire point. So if you have this one, you add another. So if you were at 7, you go to 8. If you were at 8, you'd now move to 9. How about the October 22 poison birds, the appliance delivery fees, the babies throwing foods, and the terracotta warriors from China? We've talked about this one before, and we had it at 0. We're going to stick with that and say that it does not move the scale. And then let's take a look at the 2 new scales, or the 2 new LR sections. The first one with the kangaroo rat noses, smog effects, barefoot driving, and the superhero movies. We don't think this moves the scale. You'd stay at 0 there. And then last, the vitamin E benefits, coffee and Lyme disease, British Mills, and the turmeric and ginger. We're going to say that this one moves at 0.5, which if you recall from prior recaps means that at the 170 level, it doesn't affect you. You actually add 0. But if you are scoring lower than that, say 155, 160, even 165, we think this moves the scale at that range. So for the truly high-level 170 scores, you don't get a break from this. But if you're not quite at that level, you do get a break for it. That's what the 0.5 means. And so you can see there's a wide range of outcomes there. Theoretically, you could get anywhere from 7 to 9.5, but some of those are not possible because of the combinations they didn't use. Either way, we'll all find out on Wednesday, February 5th at 9 a.m. Eastern time as to how things kind of like shook out.
Yeah, I think 7 and 9 is probably as far as you could go. I don't think there's a 9.5, but it's there's an 8.5 in there. There's a 7.5 in there. There's definitely some intermediate points. It's it's an interesting one for sure. We shall see, but yeah, this was a long week. I'm glad it's over. I know everyone else certainly feels the same way. And to wrap this up, I'll just say congratulations to everyone The year's off to a banging start. And I'm proud of all of you guys for getting through this. This was a tough, grueling week, but I'm proud of everybody. And the resilience I saw from everyone getting through this one was impressive. So congrats.
Yeah, theoretically you could get 9.5, but I don't think they combined that fairy circles with the coffee and lime disease that I saw. So I think that's what you're saying is the maximum out would be like 9 there.
Yeah, I didn't see that either. Yeah,
exactly. All right. On that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment and rating as well. And if you have any questions or test reports, especially if you had that crazy RC section we're not sure about, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. Jon and I will be back again next week doing a recap of the year 2024, which got delayed, unfortunately, by the terrible LA fires, but we're still going to do it. Still have that conversation. In the meantime, we hope this was useful. We hope your test went exceedingly well. Stay safe out there, and we will talk to you soon.